And here we go. Natal, welcome back to the Learning and Development Podcast, and congratulations on your new book, Agile L&D.
Woohoo! So exciting. I've just received it in the mail and it's fabulous to be back again. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
You're very welcome. Now, Natal, with the speed at which trends come and go in L&D, it's been a while since Agile was the talk of the town, but it's not gone away. So I wonder if you could let us know what the current state of affairs is, what you're seeing, and perhaps what the need for the book is now.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. And also why focus on Agile L&D, where I previously looked at Agile HR.
Mm.
And there's a number of factors that sit in this. And the first is there's just a maturity, I think, of the topic of business agility. So rather than just agile as project management or building a backlog, there's a shift in the conversation across all businesses, all industries around how do I deal with the complexity, the change, the continuous uncertainty around me. And it's really interesting because I think it's also led to an appreciation that to to build business agility, it's about forming a toolkit for your context, your industry, the size of your company, and the purpose of your business or the product that you deliver. So I think people have let go a bit of, oh my God, I must do Scrum by the textbook, or I must do, it's all about a Kanban board, and actually embracing a bit more probably of what we used to call the mindset. How do I adapt and respond in this ever-changing world that I now operate in? Then there's been a shift, I think, that feeds off that links into what I call the new people operating model. There's quite a few people talking about this. So Burson calls it systemic HR. Am I allowed to say my joke? Maybe, which I think sounds like a bit of a disease, but anyway. And then you've got the new Gartner model, which is talking about this kind of strategic collect. And you've even got people like Jessica Swam doing books like Built for People, where it's all about, hey, we need a new way that we deliver out the employee experience product. And we need to be structured differently to do that. And that leads to, I think, a new appreciation of how do you work much more end-to-end, multi-skilled, and learning, and OD is a crucial component of all of that. The other couple of areas is one, which I know you talk a lot about, and some other people that have been on this podcast, is product management as the focus now. So within business, there's a shift of kind of, we used to have more this customer experience focus, but now it's how do you actually build the experience around the product? So the whole organization is engineered to delivering that out. And then the product, often very digital, is all about loyalty, top up, subscription, selling other additions to the product. And we can actually create that kind of model in our organization because people sign up to our employee experience product. So then again, there's a whole range of skills that sit behind delivering that product. And so I think that's starting to really influence the world of L&D, particularly because so much of L&D is a digital product now as well, but wrapped with sort of an experience is wrapped around it. And then, there's just big, massive problems to solve. Skills, AI, climate emergency, none of these can be solved in the way that we've worked up until now. So I think just everyone's realizing we need a different way. It does surprise me because I think because you're interviewed for the book and I asked you, do we still need this? Because sometimes I work in my bubble of great teams doing great things. And you also agreed, no, we do. And I was just working with a team this week where it's very obvious they really need to transition. And so learning all of this is so key. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant, Natal. There's so much there we're going to dive into during the rest of the conversation. But yes, spoiler alert, it's still good reason to read the book. I did agree there is still a need for Agile. But you mentioned a couple of other things there, Natal. I think it's really important to remember. Sometimes in L&D, we're overloaded with these different trends, but the things that make a difference dovetail nicely. You mentioned there about AI and skills and the agility that taking a skills-based learning approach to learning and development and people development provides an agility for the organization, because if you're laser focused on the gaps, what's actually required both for today to affect performance and tomorrow to plug those skills gaps and provide deep rich talent pools for your organization, we can't do that by just doing the same stuff that we've always done. Now, AI allows us to skills map in minutes where it might have taken years to do an organization previously, but to get from some robust analysis or data around what it is that people do to actually them doing it also requires an agile approach. So do you see this all working in a system?
Yes, definitely. And so there's a couple of things. One is that I've just come back from a conference, and one of the topics I talked about is this description of our context as fundamental uncertainty now. So up until now, we've been talking about VUCA and, oh, it's ambiguous, it's uncertain, but an element that perhaps we could find out the missing information. You could, if you started working at it, you would get all the information and then you could be comfortable with your decision. And with this environment of fundamental uncertainty, the idea is you will always now need to move and make decisions not knowing everything.
Yeah.
And because change is going to happen maybe tomorrow, and you don't know what that is yet, but you need to factor that in now to how you run a business. And we now need to be able to scale teams up, down, at pace. Okay, we now need to innovate this product, or actually we need to kill this one off and we now need to move over to another part of the industry and kind of scale up there. To do that, you want to be operating, yes, exactly at that skills and roles level. So someone might have multiple roles because they have a collection of skills. But that debate, we've been talking about this concept of skills-based talent development for a while, unfortunately led to people over engineering these huge, when I need to map all the skills, I need to know everything, and then I can start to build out a skills-based approach, or I can decide how to bring a team together. No, we need to, this, as you said, at pace. So something like AI allowing you to instantly map the skills, you now have information that you can take action on. And we can go and target the business challenge itself. And that business challenge might require you to upskill certain people. You might need to bring in people that have similar skills and then help them get going in the new job. Or you might need to source or, create a kind of learning across multiple teams. But you don't know what those answers, those solutions are until you know what the problem is and what skills you're going after and what you're trying to achieve. So, so all of that equals an agile approach in my mind, definitely.
Brilliant. Again, so much we need to go deep on, Natal. So we'll get going on that. But before we do, what you've just described there reminds me of a previous conversation I had with director of people and development, Brandon Caldwell at Retail 365 Retail Markets. They do the hardware and the software for self-checkouts. There's an industry that needs to be ahead of the curve in order to maintain its advantage. And he was describing how in a previous job, he skills mapped his organization. I think he said it took him 3 to 5 years, use Skills GPT, so AI powered skills mapping tool. And he's talking with his stakeholder in minutes around the actual job, which again speaks to the agility that we're able to employ now. So that enables us to have those conversations in the moment using dynamic benchmarks data, and then use that as a foundation to move on to the actual specifics and the nuance. But again, it goes back to, it's all right. First of all, I suppose that's the mindset that you described before, which is if we are able to move at pace and we are able to collect data in the moment to meet the needs today and plan for tomorrow, then we don't need to make these big bets, huge systems, huge programs, scheduling and development that means that people won't experience what we're doing for months, maybe even years in an enterprise-wide organization, by which time you and I know, and the listener knows as well, that's likely to be out of date.
Totally. And so there's a couple of things. One is pace. So you've got to deliver now, not tomorrow. And I keep talking about the now of work. So we constantly talk about the future of work and designing for the future of work. It's here. And you've actually got to solve problems today. And that's going to set you up for the future. And your business is doing that. So we've got to be able to deliver people solutions around that. Also, you can't do it all. So we are now in an environment where we are overloaded. Everyone's feeling burnt out, stressed. And that's because we've had this merging of the personal, the social, and the work life has all gone into one since the pandemic. And the world of work is shifting. So we work differently now. It is more digital. Even if you're going into the office or the warehouse, you are most likely talking to other people in a digital way. A lot of people talk about going into the office and being on the Teams call anyways, but the nature of how we collaborate, how we get things done has shifted. So all of that equals, oh, wow, there's so much to do. Where do I start? And the only way to do that is to break it down into a prioritized list of problems to solve and then start to deliver. Okay, if I can go after this one and I start to deliver some value, then I'm making an impact. And actually, by doing that, you start to change the nature of the overriding problem itself and things start to move. And then if you've delivered enough value, hey, let's get on to the next one, or the one that's now that was related. And that is that incremental development. That is that idea of test and learn, get something out, show some value, get some feedback, get data, and then use that to either further build the solution or pivot. And all of this, I don't think this sounds too radical now. When I wrote the first book, maybe people were like, oh, but how do you do that in the world of L&D and people? But I think everyone gets it now. I think a lot of people are still struggling with the how. And that's definitely why I saw that the book was quite important. And people had asked me to write it. Yeah.
Lift the lid then. Let's get into the book, Natal, because I think that we've been touching on the difference between agile L&D and traditional approaches. You've touched on one there that I'm a huge advocate for and mentioned so many times on this podcast, and that's the backlog versus the learning needs analysis. Because the learning needs analysis was a tool we used for a bygone era when learning and development was time. It took an enormous amount of time, was hugely expensive. It was a massive bet, top down for huge groups across an entire organization, and could be prioritized based on, we haven't done anything for that group for a while, what shall we do? So again, there are broad assumptions for vast cohorts across the organization, and we haven't got into performance, or what we're trying to solve for them. Whereas where you talked there, and I'd love you to explore this with us, the backlog, which talks about the value to the organization first and prioritizes that in a list so that everyone can see that what you're working on. Everybody can agree or disagree or challenge. That's what should be the highest priority, and then the next and the next. But quantified by the value to the organization and the group, which I think is so much more powerful than a learning needs analysis. And as an initial interaction between the L&D team and the business, speaks a very different type of value, which again is credible, rather than this one where we prioritize learning needs, and quite frankly, who should really care? I'd like to be brutal, but
I'm a big believer of moving beyond the learning needs analysis way. And it was interesting writing this book because I started my career in learning and development, but because I know you talk a lot about the performance mindset. How do we move away from this sort of learning mindset where make people curious and they'll come to the learning, as opposed to, okay, what are we trying to solve for and how do we know we're going to do that? And what's the evidence that we're solving the problem through whatever the learning and OD solution is. But I started my career in business teams. So I didn't sit in HR. I sat as a coach in business teams. And so there was a different sort of remit I found in that environment. And then when I actually then was hired by my first sort of HR team, and at first I was like, oh, why are people asking me about payroll and grievances? I'm learning, I'm cool, I'm funky, this kind of thing. And then I went, oh, hang on, no, it's all one. And that's something that perhaps we don't appreciate enough. I think maybe when you do come from more that learning and development background, that people, they don't see the training program, the pay that they get, and the experience they had when they started on their first day as different. They just see that all as the employee experience. Like it's the whole, and you've got to be mindful of, in all of that, what's working and what isn't, and how do you, and where you're targeting. Why I talk about that is that I feel like there's a need to lift up. So where do I feel that L&D, Agile L&D is different? I've distilled it into 5 principles.
Mhm.
And the first one I call product led. And this is about the value that you talk about. So first of all, it's seeing the whole employee experience as our product, made up of component parts, yeah? Onboard recruiting, career development, team development, reward. But the whole thing, you need to be able to understand that whole product. What does it look like? How do you visualize the work that sits in there? What have you already designed and need to maintain and keep delivering? What's new? What are the new problems to solve? How do you know which ones to go after? What products and services do you need to get rid of because they're not working anymore? So what is the whole kind of load that you give out across the organization? Now, yes, you can start within the L&D team yourself. So at least having that full portfolio view of everything that you're delivering out, maintaining, killing off, innovating. But to do that, you have to know the value because, again, you can't do everything. You can't meet every request. You can't meet every needs analysis. So you need a way to ruthlessly prioritize where you spend your time. And you only can do that by understanding value. And value comes from solving problems. Products solve problems for people. There's an old saying that you don't go to the hardware to buy a drill. You go and buy a drill to drill a hole to put your picture up. So actually, what is it that you're enabling your people to do? How are you making their working life easier, better? How are you helping that first manager connect with their team on day one, understand how to have a good feedback conversation, knowing how to build a team working agreement or a strategy? They're skills that are problems to solve ultimately. And your manager is not going to see that as going off to a 2-day management development program. They're going to see it as problems to solve on the day. Oh God, I've got to have this conversation. How do I do it? So by breaking it down, so seeing what you deliver across the organization as a product made up of component parts, you then need to understand what is that product doing, what's it solving for. Then you can track it. Then you can decide where to spend your time, what isn't as important, what to say no to, what to say not yet to. And it's an operating model basically for how you start to deliver your learning and OD interventions. So that's the first one. The second one is human-centered design. So needs analysis is great, but how do you get into the lived experience of work? But you've got to do it at pace. So this is, I can't separate agile project management from design thinking in the L&D space. They go hand in hand, and actually doing a quick kind of discovery, what I call a design thinking sprint at the start of any problem. So you actually know what to solve for. Because if you start with a big complex problem, we need to build leaders for future roles that we don't know what they are yet, but we need to build them. Okay, what is the problem there? So you need to quickly find out. Then you can scope your backlog. Okay, these are the things we need to go after. Let's build that backlog, as you said. Let's start here because it's either the most valuable thing or something that it's a hypothesis to test first. Let's get something out, get something of value, and off you go. So product-led, human-centered design helps you understand what problems to solve for your product. Experimentation, like just so key. We can come back to that. But what's your hypothesis? How do you know? How do you test it? And then how do you then release based on the data that you collect? Then the next one is I call T-shaped people in T-shaped teams. This is that you can't solve complex problems in silos, and you particularly, I hate to break it to some of our more learning and development traditionists, but just learning and development working by themselves, you're not going to be able to solve for everything. You need to be able to be working with talent development, OD, well-being, reward, because a lot of the solutions that we're looking at cut across all of those. So we need to now understand what are our T-shape and what's a T-shaped team. And then ultimately it all comes together with deliver with impact. And this is what you talk about a lot as well, this shift from activity to outcomes, not just output, value. So how do we know? To do that, you've got to know the problem. You got to then set up some ways to measure how you are solving it. And then when you solve it, you can demonstrate that it's happened and you've delivered value, and you can move on to the next problem to solve. Yeah.
Brilliant.
So that was a lot.
There is, but I love the way that it ties together. That I don't know whether it's 3 or 4 of those are about the impact, right? So much. And the reason I say that is that learning and development traditionally is done because we develop the solutions, we deliver the solutions, then we look back and say, did it work? Whereas what you've just described there is your first two are around truly understanding the problem through data, through business need, and then with the human-centered part, the lived experience of the people who are responsible for doing the work. Then the last one there is a bit about the impact. But the reason I said, and I don't know whether it's 3 or 4, is your experimentation in there as well. Because as opposed to the big bets that we described earlier, which are traditional learning and development, which is the all-encompassing system, the comprehensive curricula, the comprehensive or vast suites of content, all of these huge expensive bets, as opposed to what you just described there, which is, I don't want to put words into your mouth. I suppose this is an invitation into to challenge or validate here. It's about what are the small bets we're going to make that we think are going to start moving us in the right direction.
Yeah.
Not necessarily looking for the perfect solution now, but it's almost like thinking about a dial. What, looking at, if you're thinking, right, we're not going to do everything here, but what if we just did those parts? But I suppose just adding in there as well is that what you were also mentioning is what Carl Binder has talked about on this podcast before, and recognizes that when you're talking about performance at the outset, be ready. There are these 6 elements that are going to come out of your conversations, which are the other empowering or restricting elements that are relationships or hierarchy, systems, access to information, all of this stuff that isn't necessarily learning and development. But if you don't talk about it, then you're seriously missing huge parts of what are contributory factors to performance.
Big time. And I think it's if we think about where business is going, it's also and this is where business agility comes into the conversation. So most businesses are looking at how do they have the kind of a value stream through the business. Everyone is working towards the delivery of that value through to that end customer. So maybe starts with research and development, or it moves into the marketing team, and then you've got the salespeople, but then you've got the engineers and the product developers. But everyone should be working towards how do they know what problems are they solving for the customer? How does it give them value? How do they make it better? And we have to take that mindset now into the world of L&D. And I advocate for people overall, what would be HR and people. Now, I know it really varies in L&D. Sometimes we don't sit with HR. Sometimes we're just an L&D company. So there's lots of different ways that we operate in L&D. But we need to understand how we sit in that value stream. And so anything that we do, learning initiatives, skills development, even if it is, and a lot of us get involved in all kinds of things from well-being to talent to onboarding. So a lot of I find what sits in L&D and OD really messy anyway. There's no cutoff point. You can sometimes we lead the cultural transformation. We lead we're changing the values and mindset of the whole organization. And so that involves so many different skills. And so we've got to understand how we solve for the business challenge. We don't just solve for our lane, which is maybe e-learning, or I do a facilitated management development, or I do leadership, I do skills. No, how do we actually do that together? Probably with other people in people and definitely the business. And then what we produce has to help people be better in their job and help that value stream. So by helping people either have better sales calls or have better feedback conversations or talk about performance with their team, by developing people to do that, that then makes the business operate. And you can measure that. You can look, there's data all around to look at those things, because we often talk about we can't measure things in L&D or traditionally. And no, once you know the problem you're solving for, there's a whole range of data points that you can then track to see that whether your solution is fixing the problem. And so exactly that. So we sit in a value stream that ultimately that produces value through to that end customer. The end customer could be community if it's a not-for-profit, but ultimately your whole business is engineered towards that. And we sit in that value stream. So what are we doing to help people get the job done? And for me, that's a real shift, because that's not, you don't want to take people away from the job. You don't want to add things onto the job. You need to actually make it, and we talk about in the flow of work, because otherwise people won't see the connection. They'll find it like it's an add-on. It takes time, and it's not going to probably be as successful as whether you can link it to the thing that they need to do. Yeah.
It's so interesting that the L&D leaders that I've spoken to on the podcast, when they're solving for real problems, they talk about how efficiently they can help the end user, the employee, to do what they're trying to do. So instead of measuring bums on seats and hours and days spent learning, they look to see how little time people have spent outside of the workflow to help them to do that thing, which is a fundamental shift, which goes back to, if you don't know what the problems are, everything looks like a solution, and we spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in our organizations trying to solve undefined problems. But when you know what the problem is, you can be laser focused to move at speed to help to address that, and then know that whether you've made progress to it or not. The two different types of learning and development are night and day compared to with making or planning for impact and then hoping for impact, but wondering whether you ever will.
Totally. Yeah. Sorry. I was just exactly that, because if career development is the issue, okay, so what's happening? Is it that people are leaving because they are citing the lack of career development? And then are they leaving at a certain point after 2 years, maybe, or are they leaving when they first arrive? Is it that there's a lack of movement in the organization? Is it that people they stay in one job for a very long period of time and don't feel like they're progressing? Where often when we talk about, oh, we've got a career development problem, so many teams will move to, oh, we need a career development framework. We need a competency framework. We need to show career pathways. Hang on, let's find out what's really going on here.
Yeah.
And some organizations with that problem found that actually there was loads of career opportunities, but no one could find them in the organization. They didn't know how to apply. So it's led to maybe a marketplace type solution where people can actually find roles and apply for roles and then develop themselves towards certain roles that are available. And all of that you can track. Okay, are people now not leaving like they were before? Do people move around more? How are people feeling about that? What's happening if they do leave, what's happening in the exit interviews? So I feel like every big challenge that we face, there's always ways of breaking it down into what's really going on the ground and looking at that data and then thinking, how do I shift it? And it just leads to a very different way of working, doesn't it?
Yeah. And again, so take it back to one of the earlier questions in here in this conversation, Natal, when I asked you the difference between traditional L&D and agile L&D, the first one you described there is traditional L&D providing learning. So we hear anecdotally that there is a problem around career development, and so we provide learning. The opposite way of doing that, and the way that you've just advocated, is solve the problem. But you can only solve the problem if you understand the problem. So you seek data to understand not just what the problem is, but where it's most keenly being experienced, and run an experiment where there is the greatest need, and then look for opportunities to scale that elsewhere. But again, it's so different. Providing learning and solving problems are fundamentally different approaches to learning and development.
They are. And it was interesting because I had the pleasure of interviewing yourself and range of L&D and people leaders. And it was really interesting. A lot of them talked about this realization when they went, hang on, I solve for the business problem, not just for the learning solution. And one of the head of L&D, he said, oh, I felt like whenever I gave my team the problem, if I gave it to the e-learning specialist, we had an e-learning solution. If I gave it to leadership specialist, we had a leadership solution. And so I needed to lift us all up to going, all right, what is the problem and how do we solve this together? And that could have a range of different aspects in the solution. And that's what this is about. It's not saying that all your skills and experience up until now as an L&D professional isn't valid anymore. No, but it's channeling it in a different way. It's lifting up and understanding the wider context in which your learning solution is operating. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. I'm a huge advocate for learning and development, quite obviously. And the way I like to describe it is that the skills and credibility that we've built so far, it's just not enough anymore.
Yes.
There are greater tools. But it leads me to the next question. We talked about all of this stuff. There's all of this terminology, and anybody listening can't help but be convinced that there's benefit in this. But I've got to ask, is it important that L&D become students of Agile in order to get started? Or are there entry-level elements that could be adopted in order to build confidence over time?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I actually think there can be a little bit of a danger in running into sort of think, okay, I'm going to go and do a agile program. Now, of course, I advocate that because people might even come to me, but everything sits within a context. A lot of people maybe even go off and learn Scrum as a first step, or they go and do agile project management. But if you're not understanding why first, and you're not linking it back to why you're needing to use this, then it can feel disjointed and you maybe struggle to know how to introduce it. So I often talk about the best way to start is taking that nice, juicy, complex problem and using a few techniques and I think a lot of people on this podcast would know things like the double diamond of design thinking, the idea that you go and step into what's going on for your people. So go and create some personas, do an experience map, go and get some people data around, and the data that you already have. Are people leaving? What are they doing? What's the time to market? What's the productivity levels? And just go and do a good analysis of that issue. And then form a few problem statements. Okay, if we go back to that career development, it's maybe, okay, we've got jobs, but they're not visible. Maybe the next one was, it looks like managers they're not supportive enough of career development. So how would we focus on that? Maybe another one is that you see that people want to feel stretched and progress, but in the job that they're in. So what would that look like to solve for? Maybe another one is that it's come out that people like to be seen as a coach and a mentor. It's not about job progression, but it's about feeling like the expert. Okay, how do we solve for that? So a list of problems, and then that equals a hypothesis. So then just go and create a safe, small experiment and test something. And what I find is if you make it more about the problem you're solving, the business challenge itself, and you talk in that language, people don't feel like it's this new thing. They don't get scared about the agile jargon.
Yeah.
And you'll learn so much from that. Also, by doing that, you'll then see, okay, yeah, knowing how to do a backlog is going to be very useful here, or knowing how to analyze my hypothesis and move that into a test and learn incremental development cycle. Great. But it's a bit hard to jump there if you haven't. I think you've got to get in and play a bit. That's I suppose my message here. But what I would say is if you do that, give it some safety, carve out time. Agile is about working as a team. Allow that team to either focus on that issue for 2 weeks solid, and they're allowed to work in this new way, or every Thursday they come together, they do some of their kind of rituals, kind of the planning ritual, or looking at their backlog, or having a review and a retro. And I'm starting to use jargon now, so I can talk about that. But I think if they go back to the last one, they would hear some more definitions on that, actually. But anyways, but also on the Thursday, people just get work done on that project, because what's happening in business across loads of organizations I work with is people are just task switching constantly. They're trying to cover too much ground in any one day or in any one kind of strategy. And Agile is about being, as you call it, laser focus, right? What is the thing that we're solving for first? Right. Let's try and get that out at pace. 2 weeks, a month. Have we got something? Have we got some value? Can we measure this? Now let's go again. And we're not going to move on to the next one until we can show some value in that first one. So by looking more in that way and going, okay, well, so therefore the team needs to have focus and they need permission to play and they need safety around that, then they have a greater chance of success. And so I think that's really important, particularly for any leaders listening to this. Give people the space to play with this. Treat it as an agile experiment. What's your hypothesis? And actually, one more thing is that we often embrace this way of working because we need to solve problems ourselves. We need to deliver faster. We need to have more data or evidence before we release the product, or we need to be more collaborative. We need to be more human-centric. So what your metrics that you want to shift, and then go and design a way to test and experiment against that. Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier, Natal, and this is going to be a common one, is that with adopting Agile, there can be a lack of certainty about what the solutions might look like, and therefore selling it to a client group who knows how to buy and sell training could be problematic. How should we approach this, or how have you approached this that's worked for you?
So it relates back to, okay, we have a tendency in L&D, but also the wider people function, of having the solution in mind when we talk about the business challenge. So we hear statements like, oh, hybrid working isn't successful. Everyone needs to come back 5 days a week. So we've already given the solution in the statement. And nearly every learning professional listening to this would have heard a manager come up to them and say, oh, my team's not performing. They need time management skills, or we need to go on a team bonding session. Oh, okay. Why is that? And I think it's maybe the nature of what we do, because everyone is an employee. Everyone has learnt something. Everyone works in the organization. So everyone's got an opinion of how to solve for a learning and development problem. So I think that's hard. We also we're in a market that people are pitching as the solution as part of the product. Hey, take this learning management system. It's going to ensure that you can release all this learning in the flow of work, and it's going to solve all your problems. Oh, really? What sits behind that? So I think a lot of part of this is, again, going, okay, what am I solving for? And have those conversations. And so I might talk about an example here, but one of the things I spend a lot of time on with teams is actually looking at the business challenge at a high level to begin with. And we don't talk about solutions. We just talk about what is going on with the challenge. And if we solved it, what would be the value to the business, bottom line, the end customer, and then the employee? And there's metrics in that. And so now you're going, oh, okay, so these are the metrics we need to either shift or we need to go after. And then we move into, all right, what do we know about this problem? How do we quickly get a prioritized list of problems to solve? And then you've got a project structure. And so you can actually take your senior leaders along quite quickly on that journey, because they are interested in solving that business challenge. You don't have to say, and you go, and this is the data we want to shift or to have impact on. So can we now go and test a first solution based on that to see if we get some evidence to do that? Generally, when you speak like that, people are totally for it, because they want to solve the problem with you. So it's less about, oh, I don't have the solution, here's my 6-month plan. This is the problem. This is the first thing we're going to do to test whether it solves it. Let's do that. Let's look at the data. Okay, now we have more of a longer term plan. So a good example that's in the book actually is, I'll use more of a direct L&D one. There was a person working in a sort of head of talent leadership role and was asked to do C-suite executive learning. They need something they're calling out for it was the request. And so this person went, you know what? So first of all, if I fly everyone off to a big business program over at Stanford or something, this is going to be really expensive. And actually, we're a digital business now, where it's a big finance industry organization. We're actually digital now. We should be doing it more in a kind of digital collaborative way. So they had a few ideas. So what they did first is they sketched out 5 prototypes and went and pitched that to a series of senior leaders. And we're talking rough and ready, but that gave them enough information to form some design principles. And what they had is they formed a hypotheses around each design principle. So the first one was content. So they found that senior executive leaders needed to feel special. They needed some status. So they wanted to study with the experts. So that led them went, okay, it's not necessarily where they study, it's that they feel like they're accessing expertise. So they did some quick UX of 2 possible business school platforms and went, let's go with this one. It's got a better user experience, less content, but let's try this one first. And they just signed up for a very short 6-week sprint test. The next one was coaching and connection. So what came out of this pitching was it can't just be digital. So actually, people need to feel like they're connecting with others. There's support. They've got their peer group. Okay, so they went, let's build some coaching circles around this 6 weeks program. And hypothesis here is that people feel connected, supported, they're getting feedback from peers, and that actually gives them a sense of more of a face-to-face environment along with it. And then the final one was context. And they went, there needs to be skin in the game. And we need to know whatever initiative is actually delivering against the business strategy. So they got the senior executive of strategy involved. He then designed set projects that related directly to the business strategy. And the hypothesis there was that there would be evidence that these projects made a difference to the strategy and executed results, and that the head of strategy thought that what he saw as an outcome of these projects was good, valid work that was going to shift the business. Then they set up, of course, a whole bunch of data points, user experience, evidence of impact, how recommendations to other people. So a mix of data points. And off they went for their first 6 weeks. Halfway in, it was proving to be so successful, they started another one. They only started with 9 people to begin with. I touched base with this person recently, and it's now a fully fledged program across the whole organization. And we're talking about hundreds of people going through it. But it shows you that start small, test it, even just on pen and paper to begin with, then get the outcome of that as some core principles, form your hypotheses, and then start to design around that. And then, but when you're doing it, have mindful that you want to scale as you go if it's successful. So in the background, they were like, okay, what's the vendor arrangements? What do we need to do? What would we need to go big? But in that, I think that's an interesting one, because the challenge was we need to develop our senior leaders to have impact on the strategy. So there's your long-term vision. And then you could, at each stage, you could show a value. So I feel like you didn't need to have the solution straight away there, because you were demonstrating value and impact along the whole at every stage. And by working that way, we just engage the business in a whole new way as well.
Yeah, brilliant. That's such a valuable and detailed example there, Natal. And I think that for 70 or 80% of stakeholders that ask for your help, you will get to that stage. I was speaking with Christopher Lind recently for a recent episode. He's Chief Learning Officer at ChenMed. And he said that, so we were exploring how do you change a stakeholder's mind or bring them with you towards impactful L&D. And when they are insistent that they want the thing that they asked you for, his phrase it was, you got to decide whether that's the hill you want to die on, right? But the thing is that and it's really important. A lot of L&D people won't engage in the conversation about the impact and then push that for fear of having that conversation with 20% of stakeholders. What we're talking about here is the other 80% who really want impact and want you to lead them towards that. Perhaps it would be an unexpected conversation, but one that after that first interaction, they will be really pleased that they called you. We shouldn't be fearful of pushback. We should never be fearful anyway. What we should be more fearful of is that we build a reputation as the organization, as the function that spends money but doesn't always deliver impact, but where we can build a strong career out of standing for impact and then leading our organizations and our stakeholders towards that.
Totally. And the thing about I like that. Will you die on that hill? But so what I find really interesting, and it was just all happened yesterday for me when I was working with a client, is so if a senior leader comes to you with the solution in mind, if you go and mock that up, even on pen and paper or create a little kind of simulation or whatever. Or I've had teams that even mock up examples of maybe the digital product itself, but on cardboard, and again, show it to people and then they interact with it, and or give them a little kind of storyboard of what the experience will be like. They will rip that apart. So if you go back to them just on that level and go, okay, so you've said you want this. All right, just so I know that this is going to hit the mark. And if you're then asking the questions of how will this fix your problem? What data do we need to have? What's the metrics that we need to influence or have an impact on? That you will start to have such a different conversation. And they themselves will go, oh yeah, that probably won't lead to what I'm thinking of here. So how do we do that differently? So for me, it's leaning into that conversation. When they come to you with that, oh, we need a time management program. Okay, for what reason? What are we trying to solve for here? What's the metrics around that? And engage them on their level. And most of the time, I find that senior leaders want to have that conversation. Yeah. It's a much better way. And it gives you more credibility with what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Look, I think that the what we've been describing here is inarguable, the benefits of Agile, although it is a fundamentally different way to the established practice of L&D. So as a final question, Natal, how would you suggest that the listener get started if they want to begin their journey of Agile L&D?
Come along to I do lots of free meetups. Everyone's welcome. And I have lots of guest speakers talking about their examples. So come and join us. Indeed, we're doing the book launch. So read my book. But then within your own organization, often there's teams that are working this way. Go and visit them. Go and see what they're doing. Why did they do this? Or now, you said at the start, Agile L&D is not a new thing. So there will be people in your network that are working more this way. Go and have a chat to them. Find out why they did it. Find out what's going on. And then the next one is, what's your hypothesis of the problem you need to solve by potentially working in this way? Is there too much waste? Is it that you've got a massive wish list and you need to prioritize better? Is there implementation risk? So you're doing these big programs and it's very risky and you want to break it down. Are there lots of competing remits going on in your team and everyone's trying to run their own project and taking each other's time and you don't have the capacity, and so you're not really getting enough done or you're not delivering the value at the level that you want? So what is your problem that you want to solve? What's your hypothesis? And then think about what are some methods to help you get there. And by doing that, you'll start to develop an approach that you can go and apply to any other business challenge. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Natal. We'll put some links in the show notes as well to your book and where people can find information on the meetups as well. Yes, Agile L&D out now in all good bookshops and some rubbish ones as well. But Natal, this has been hugely valuable conversation again. You mentioned earlier that we'd had a previous conversation, so this is part 2 of our Agile L&D exploration. But all's left me to say is thank you very much again for returning and being a guest on the Learning and Development Podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.